The conference room smelled like stale coffee and a decision that had already been made. I walked in at 8 on a Monday morning the way I always did, first through the door, notebook open, ready. 8 years of Mondays that way. 8 years of being the person who set the tone before anyone else had finished their first cup. The room was full. My team sat down both sides of the table. Directors. Department heads. People I had hired, trained, and pulled through 3 product launches and 2 company downturns. They were all there. And so was he. He was sitting beside the CEO, Marcus Cole, wearing a suit with crease lines still pressed into the sleeves like it had come straight off a store shelf that morning. 26 years old. Smooth face. The practiced smile of a person who had been told they were special every single day of their life and had never once been given a reason to doubt it. I didn't know his name yet. Marcus cleared his throat. He didn't look at me when he started talking. He looked at the boy. "We're excited about the new direction," Marcus said. "And Sophia, starting this week, you'll begin transitioning your responsibilities. We don't want knowledge walking out the door." The room went completely still. I felt my pulse in my throat. I nodded. That was the worst part. Not what Marcus said. Not the boy's practiced smile. Not the silence from people I had mentored through some of the hardest stretches of their careers. The worst part was that I nodded. "Of course," I said. Calm voice. Steady face. The voice I used with difficult clients when I needed them to believe everything was under control even when it wasn't. Inside, something tore clean through. Because humiliation doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with sirens or dramatic music. It just settles into your chest quietly, like a stone dropped into deep water. You feel the weight of it long before you hear the splash. Marcus leaned back in his chair, satisfied. The boy, whose name I learned afterward was Preston Hale, glanced at me with an expression that landed somewhere between pity and excitement. The meeting moved forward like my career hadn't just been disassembled in front of 30 people. But I felt it. The exact moment when power started leaving my hands. And not one person at that table said a single word. Not one. 8 years. 60 people hired. 2 company-saving turnarounds. And the room responded with the sound of someone quietly refilling their coffee. I wrote the date at the top of my notebook page. I underlined it twice. My name is Sophia Reynolds. I was 35 years old, and I had built the operations division of Hartwell Solutions from 3 people and 2 folding chairs into a 60-person unit that generated 40% of the company's annual revenue. I want you to understand that number before I tell you the rest. Not 3%. Not a respectable slice. 40%. I had hired every person on my team personally. I had stayed late with junior analysts walking them through their first client presentations. I had called vendors at 11 at night during the supply chain crisis to keep contracts from collapsing. I had rewritten the operations playbook from scratch twice. I had saved Hartwell Solutions during a revenue drought in my 3rd year, restructuring 3 underperforming accounts and bringing them back to profitability within a single quarter. I did it again in year 6. Different crisis, same outcome. And now Marcus Cole, who had bought his 2nd vacation home the year after that 2nd turnaround, was sitting at the head of the table telling me to transfer my brain into a 26-year-old who had finished university 4 months ago and played golf with his brother-in-law. No performance review. No conversation. No warning. Just favoritism dressed in a blazer. And I was expected to smile and begin. Preston Hale showed up to our first training session on a Wednesday morning with a leather notebook that looked like it had never been written in. He was punctual. I gave him that. He was sitting at the small conference table when I arrived, pen already uncapped, smile already calibrated. "So where do we start?" he asked. I looked at him for one long second. Long enough to take inventory. He was confident the way people are confident when they have never been truly tested. Not arrogance exactly. More like the comfortable assumption that the world was going to cooperate. That doors would open because they always had. He had no idea what this division actually was. What it cost to build. What it cost to run. The specific phone calls, difficult conversations, and judgment calls made at 7 in the morning that kept 40% of this company's revenue from quietly falling apart. We start with the vendor management framework, I said. Pull up your laptop. And I began. Because here is what Marcus Cole did not understand when he set this arrangement in motion. Information and expertise are not the same thing. You can hand someone a map. You cannot hand them 20 years of knowing how terrain actually feels under your feet. I was going to give Preston a very thorough map. Over the following 3 weeks, I trained Preston Hale with complete professionalism. Every process document. Every workflow template. Every vendor contact sheet. Every client communication protocol. Every standard operating procedure that I had spent years writing, refining, and perfecting. I shared all of it. I was thorough. Patient. Organized. I answered every question he asked without hesitation. I walked him through systems, introduced him to key contacts, and made sure the handover looked exactly as clean and complete as Marcus Cole had requested. But here is what I kept. The instincts. I kept the knowledge of which vendor called back faster when you reached them on their personal number instead of the office line. I kept the memory of which client needed to hear about problems early or they would catastrophize, and which client needed problems solved before they heard about them at all. I kept my understanding of which team members carried the real institutional knowledge and which ones simply had impressive job titles. I kept the team psychology. The unwritten architecture of how 60 people actually functioned together, where the trust ran, and where the tension sat. None of that was in any manual. None of it ever would be. Preston received a flawless education in the surface of the job. I kept the depth, the team felt it before anyone said it out loud. People stopped stopping by my office the way they used to. Not all at once. Gradually. The way a tide goes out. You don't notice the first few inches. Then one afternoon you look down and the waterline is somewhere completely different. My door was still open. It had always been open. But people were watching which way the wind was blowing before they decided where to stand. That is just human nature. I didn't hold it against them. When power is shifting inside an organization, staying neutral is the safest instinct most people have. But I noticed who still came to me with real problems and who had started routing their questions through Preston instead. I noticed whose eyes dropped when we passed in the hallway and whose didn't. I was building a quiet map of who operated from loyalty and who operated from proximity to power. Those are two very different things, and in the months ahead, that distinction was going to matter enormously. I kept showing up. Same time every morning. Same open door. Same standards. Because I wasn't leaving yet. Not until I was ready. And I wasn't ready yet. Preston made his first real decision without consulting me on a Thursday in his third week. A mid-tier client, Vantera Logistics, had requested a modification to their service agreement. It was a negotiation I had been managing carefully for months, building toward a renewal that would lock in a 3-year contract at better terms. Preston read the most recent email chain, decided the client was being difficult, and responded with a counteroffer that was both too rigid and completely misread their actual concern. Vantera pulled back. Not dramatically. They didn't cancel anything. They simply went quiet in the way that experienced clients go quiet when they're deciding whether to stay or start looking elsewhere. Marcus, when I mentioned it carefully in a brief one-on-one, called it a learning curve. I wrote it down in the notebook I kept locked in my bag. Not because I was building a case against Preston. He wasn't my enemy. He was just inexperienced and had been handed a role several years beyond what he was ready for. Preston Hale wasn't the problem. Marcus Cole was the problem. Preston was just the consequence. The Vantera situation cost the company a mid-sized account 2 months later when they quietly moved their contract to a competitor. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that would make the quarterly report alarming. Just a crack. The first one. The second crack came 5 weeks later. A scheduling oversight on a major project delivery caused a missed deadline with a client named Forsyth Partners. The kind of deadline that requires a phone call, a formal apology, and an explanation that actually holds up under scrutiny. Preston handled the call. I was not in the room. What I heard afterward, from 2 separate team members who told me independently, was that Preston had been vague about the cause and overly optimistic about the timeline for recovery. The kind of answer that buys you a week but destroys trust over a month. Forsyth Partners didn't cancel immediately. They waited. But the relationship cooled noticeably. Then there was the vendor tension. A supplier we had worked with for 4 years started escalating invoice disputes directly to the finance department instead of coming to operations first, a significant break in the communication protocol I had spent 2 years establishing. When I asked Preston if he had spoken to the vendor, he said he planned to get to it. I wrote that down too. Pattern forming, I wrote underneath it. Not to gloat. I wrote it down because patterns are the most honest language a situation speaks. And this situation was speaking very clearly. Arrogance, I have learned, always grows louder right before it collapses. 6 weeks before I resigned, a former colleague named Philippa Monroe called me. We had worked together at my previous company years before Hartwell Solutions. She was one of the sharpest operational thinkers I had ever met and had spent the past 4 years running her own small consulting firm. She had heard through the industry what was happening at Hartwell. "Are you okay?" she asked. The question was simple, but nobody had asked it directly in weeks, and something about hearing it cracked open a small space inside me. I told her the truth. Not the professional version. The actual truth. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You know," she said, "the market has a gap right now. Mid-sized companies with operations problems and nobody competent enough to fix them. The firms that should be serving them are either too expensive or too slow. And the clients they're losing know exactly who they'd call if that person were available." She paused. "If you ever built something," she said, "people would follow." I sat with that sentence for the rest of the day. I sat with it that night. I sat with it all the way through the following week while I was professionally training my replacement with one hand and quietly beginning to see the future with the other. I did not quit immediately after that phone call. Quitting out of anger is a story that ends with you. I was interested in a story that ended with something built. Instead, I started working on 2 tracks simultaneously. On the surface, I continued doing my job. Training Preston. Managing the team. Maintaining the client relationships I could still reach. Showing up with the same professionalism that had defined every one of my 8 years at Hartwell Solutions. Underneath that surface, I spent the next 6 weeks studying the market with the same intensity one had given to every operational challenge of my career. I pulled 3 years of industry data. I identified which client segments were most frustrated with their current providers. I mapped the gap between what those clients were paying for and what they were actually receiving. I built a service model around the specific problems I knew how to solve because I had spent 8 years solving them at scale. I ran the numbers 4 times. Each time, the answer came out the same. This was viable. Not theoretically viable. Practically viable. The kind of viable that comes from knowing a market from the inside rather than reading about it. I did not tell anyone what I was doing. I just kept showing up every morning. And I kept building. I resigned on a Tuesday morning, 11 weeks after the conference room meeting. No drama. No speech. No farewell email designed to make people feel guilty. I gave 4 weeks' notice and used every day of it to document everything I legitimately could for a clean handover. I walked into Marcus Cole's office and placed the resignation letter on his desk. He read it without standing up. "Best of luck," he said. No conversation about what I was planning. No curiosity about where I was going. No reflection on 8 years of 40% revenue contribution. He picked up his phone before I had finished turning toward the door. The smirk was still there. I walked back to my office. I packed the things that were mine, a framed photo, a small plant, a coffee mug with a chip in the handle I had owned since my first real job. The security guard, a kind man named Frank, held the door. "Take care of yourself, Ms. Reynolds," he said. "Always do, Frank," I said. I put the box in the passenger seat. Then I drove home and got to work. The company was called Apex Operational Partners. I chose the name carefully. Not flashy. Not aggressive. Just precise and clean, the way good operations actually are. I incorporated it the same week I resigned, through a business attorney who had been recommended by Philippa. The legal structure was simple, built for growth, and designed to protect the intellectual work we were going to do. Philippa came on board as a co-founder. She brought her client relationships, her consulting framework, and 4 years of credibility in the exact market segment we were targeting. I brought the operational architecture. The service delivery model. The team management playbook I had been quietly refining in my own documents for the past 2 months. We rented a small office space, genuinely small, 2 rooms and a shared kitchen, in a building 20 minutes from where I used to work. I furnished it with a long table, 6 chairs, and a whiteboard that covered an entire wall. I remember standing in that empty office on the first day, looking at the blank whiteboard, holding a black marker. No crease-line suits. No golf course politics. No performance theater in front of 30 people who had learned to keep their eyes down. Just a whiteboard and everything I knew. I uncapped the marker. I began writing. The first calls I made were not recruitment calls. I called 3 people I trusted completely, professionals I had worked alongside for years who I knew operated from integrity rather than from proximity to whoever was currently in charge. I did not pitch them anything. I did not describe a plan or make promises. I simply told them the truth about what I was building and why. The first was a woman named Cecily Drummond, who had been my senior project manager at Hartwell for 5 years and was one of the most technically precise people I had ever worked with. The second was Marcus, no relation to my former CEO, a vendor negotiation specialist named Marcus Ewan who had resigned from Hartwell 2 months before I did after an unrelated conflict with the board. He had been looking for the right next step. The third was a quiet analyst named Tom Birch who most people at Hartwell had underestimated because he was reserved in meetings but whose operational instincts were consistently the best in any room he sat in. I told each of them what I was building. I told each of them I understood if the timing wasn't right. Cecily said yes before I finished the sentence. Marcus Ewan called back within the hour. Tom Birch sent a single text message, "When do we start?" That was the first domino. By the end of the second month, we had 9 people. Not 9 people who needed convincing. 9 people who had been waiting for a reason. They did not come from Hartwell all at once. 3 of them I had never even worked with before, referrals from Philippa's network and from 2 industry connections who had heard about what we were building and wanted to be part of it. But 6 of them were former colleagues who knew firsthand what it looked like when competence was valued versus when competence was merely useful until something more convenient arrived. Not one of them was bitter about it. That is an important thing to understand. These were not people who came to Apex Operational Partners out of anger or to make a point. They came because the work we were proposing to do was serious, the environment we were building was professional, and the opportunity was real. Culture isn't a slide deck. It isn't a value statement on a wall. It is the accumulated result of every decision a leader makes about what matters and what doesn't. I had spent 8 years making those decisions at Hartwell. I knew how to make them again. We launched quietly. No press release. No social media announcement. Just one exceptional piece of work delivered to one carefully chosen client. Then another. Our first client was a mid-sized supply chain company called Bridgeford Industries. They had been frustrated with their previous operations partner for 18 months. Response times were slow. Reporting was inconsistent. When problems arose, they received explanations instead of solutions. Philippa had the existing relationship. I came to the first meeting with a 40-page operational audit I had built from publicly available information about their industry, their size, and the specific challenges companies at their stage typically faced. The Bridgeford director, a direct and skeptical woman named Catherine Steele, flipped through it slowly during the meeting. She looked up after several minutes. "You built this before we agreed to work together?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She studied me for a moment. "Why?" "Because I wanted you to see what you would be getting," I said. "Not what we could do in theory. What we actually do." Catherine closed the audit. She looked at Philippa. She looked back at me. "When can you start?" she said. We started the following Monday. Bridgeford became our anchor client. Within 3 months, we had reduced their operational error rate by 31% and renegotiated 2 supplier agreements that saved them more annually than our entire retainer fee. Catherine referred us to 2 more companies before our 4th month was finished. Word traveled the way good work always does, quietly but persistently. By month 4, we had 4 active clients. By month 5, we had 6. None of them came through advertising. None of them came through a campaign or a pitch event or a polished sales process. They came through referrals. Through conversations that started with someone saying, "We worked with Apex and the results were different from what we expected." Different in a good way. Different in the way that happens when the people doing the work actually understand the work at a level that goes beyond what any process document can contain. Back at Hartwell Solutions, I was hearing things through former colleagues who still trusted me enough to speak honestly. Preston Hale had lost 2 more mid-sized clients. The Forsyth Partners relationship had deteriorated to the point where a renewal conversation had been quietly shelved. 3 team members had resigned, including 1 senior analyst who had been with the company for 6 years. Marcus Cole had reportedly blamed the departures on market competition for talent. He was not wrong about the competition part. He was simply wrong about where the talent was going. I did not celebrate any of this. A company losing ground is real people under real pressure, and most of those people had nothing to do with the decisions that created the problem. What I had was clarity. And clarity is more useful than celebration. The investor conversation happened in month 5. His name was Warren Tate. He ran a small private investment group that focused specifically on professional services firms in the operational consulting space. He had heard about Apex through Catherine Steele, who had mentioned us to him at an industry lunch. He called and asked for 30 minutes. We met at a coffee shop near our office. He was precise and unhurried in the way that people are when they are genuinely evaluating something rather than performing an evaluation. He told me that Hartwell Solutions had come up in conversations with 3 different industry contacts in the past month. Not in a favorable way. He told me the division that had previously generated 40% of their revenue was now generating closer to 28%. He told me he had done some research on where former Hartwell operational clients were going. Then he looked at me. "I think you built the right thing," he said. "And I think you built it at the right time. Are you looking for growth capital?" I told him I was open to the conversation if the terms protected the culture we were building. He smiled. "That's the right answer," he said. We talked for 2 hours. The mass exit from Hartwell happened in a single week in month 5. 5 people resigned in 7 days. Not because they had coordinated. Not because anyone had called them. Because there is a moment in a deteriorating organization when enough people independently reach the same conclusion at the same time. That moment had arrived. 2 were senior project managers. 1 was the vendor relations lead who had joined Hartwell the same year I did. 2 were analysts from the team I had built, including a woman named Nadia Clark who had been one of the quietest and most effective people on the floor. Of the 5, 3 reached out to me directly. I did not recruit any of them. I had not contacted anyone still at Hartwell since the day I resigned. Every conversation came inbound. I hired 2 of the 3 on merit, after a proper interview process. The other I referred to 2 firms I knew would be a good fit for her skills. I heard that Marcus Cole had called a meeting to address the disruption in morale. He had apparently used the words family and resilience several times. The meeting had not gone particularly well. The Forsyth Partners conversation was the turning point. I had not reached out to them. I want to emphasize that clearly. I had maintained a strict boundary about approaching any former Hartwell client directly, both for legal reasons and because it was the right thing to do. They reached out to us. A contact at Forsyth Partners who had worked with our team during a joint project 2 years earlier called Philippa directly. He said they had been evaluating their operational support situation for several months and had recently begun speaking with alternative providers. He asked if Apex would be willing to discuss a proposal. We met with the Forsyth team on a Tuesday. Their director of operations, a man named Elliot Chase, was professional and straightforward about what had frustrated him over the past 18 months and what he was looking for going forward. I listened for most of that first meeting. On Thursday, we submitted a proposal. On the following Monday, they signed. It was not the largest contract Apex had landed, but it was significant in a way that went beyond the revenue number. Forsyth Partners was the kind of client that other companies paid attention to. When they moved their business, people in the industry noticed. The phone calls to Philippa started increasing the following week. 6 months after being told to train my replacement, I was standing in my own office. Not a borrowed conference room. Not a desk in a shared space. A real office with glass walls and a view of the city and a team of 14 people working on the other side of the glass. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the clean, satisfying explosion that revenge stories are supposed to deliver. It was quieter than that. It felt like being back inside my own skin after months of wearing something that didn't fit. I stood at the glass wall and watched Cecily walking a new analyst through a client report. Tom Birch was on a call, leaning back with the unhurried confidence of someone who genuinely understood what he was talking about. The Bridgeford numbers were strong. The Forsyth onboarding was clean. Warren Tate's investment had allowed us to add 3 specialist positions we had needed since month 3. Revenue was growing at a pace that made my original projections look conservative. I wasn't done building. Not even close. But I knew exactly where I was standing. The board intervention at Hartwell Solutions happened in month 6. I heard about it through Warren Tate first, then through 2 former colleagues independently. The board had called a formal performance review for the operations division. The division that had contributed 40% of company revenue 18 months earlier was now contributing closer to 24%. 2 significant client contracts had lapsed without renewal. Vendor relationships that had taken years to build were now deteriorating visibly in the financials. Preston Hale had done his best. I genuinely believe that. He was not a bad person and not without ability. He had simply been placed 4 years too early in a role that required things no training session could transfer. Marcus Cole had called it a learning curve. The board called it a leadership concern. The review was serious and structured and conducted without the casual confidence that Marcus had maintained through the preceding year. The same room where he had told me to train my replacement. The same table. Entirely different atmosphere. I did not feel satisfaction about this. I felt something more complicated. Something that recognized the difference between a consequence and a victory. These are not the same thing. Preston Hale resigned 2 months later. Not under pressure in the dramatic sense. The way it was described to me, he had a conversation with Marcus Cole about the board's concerns, and within a week he had decided the position wasn't the right fit for him at this stage of his career. That was probably the most honest thing that had happened at Hartwell Solutions in over a year. Preston was 26 years old. He had time to find a role that matched where he actually was rather than where someone's favoritism had placed him. I genuinely hoped he would find it. Marcus Cole's situation was more complicated. The board's review had extended beyond the operations division to include broader leadership accountability. 3 consecutive quarters of declining performance in the company's core revenue driver had produced a set of questions that favorable framing could no longer adequately answer. He did not announce his departure publicly. There was no company-wide email. No farewell gathering. No carefully worded message about new chapters and gratitude for the journey. He was simply no longer the CEO of Hartwell Solutions. The smirk, which I had watched him wear through boardrooms and one-on-ones, and the kind of casual cruelty that powerful people mistake for confidence, that smirk did not survive the quarterly earnings conversation. Quietly. Without drama. Just gone. The call that mattered most came from someone I hadn't expected. It was Nadia Clark, the analyst who had left Hartwell in the week of mass resignations and whom I had referred to another firm rather than hiring directly. She called me on a Saturday morning, which was unusual. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. I didn't say it when I left because I wasn't sure how to. She told me that in her last 3 months at Hartwell, she had watched the division change in ways that had nothing to do with Preston Hale specifically. She said it had become a place where people were afraid to raise problems because problems had started being treated as signs of disloyalty rather than information the team needed. The instinct to protect the leader's narrative had replaced the instinct to protect the client. "That never happened when you were there," she said. She paused. "I just wanted you to know that people saw it. Even the ones who stayed quiet saw it." I thanked her for calling. After I hung up, I sat for a while. Not thinking about Marcus Cole or Preston Hale or any quarterly earnings report. Thinking about the 8 years. About what it had cost and what it had taught me. About the difference between a person who leads from a title and a person who leads from the work itself. I already knew which one I was. 9 months after being told to train my replacement, Apex Operational Partners had 22 employees, 11 active clients, and revenue that had cleared a threshold I had set as a stretch goal for our first full year. We had not gotten there by crushing anyone, but we had gotten there by being exceptionally good at a specific thing and being consistently honest about both what we could do and what we couldn't. We turned down 2 clients in that period because the work wasn't the right fit. We referred them both to firms better positioned for what they needed. Both of them came back to us 6 months later with different projects. Warren Tate had become not just an investor but a genuine strategic partner. His network opened doors. Our work kept them open. Philippa and I had a weekly conversation, every Thursday morning, about where the company was going and what we needed to protect as it grew. Ordinate 90 minutes of my week. I had rebuilt my team from nothing. I had rebuilt my confidence from something shakier than nothing. And somewhere in the process of doing that, I had stopped waiting for Marcus Cole's decisions to define me. His choices had been the pressure that forced everything into shape. They were not the source of the shape itself. That had always been mine. I sometimes think about that conference room. The stale coffee. The crease lines in Preston Hale's sleeves. The way Marcus Cole looked at him instead of at me when he said the thing that changed everything. The way I nodded. I don't regret nodding. That nod was the beginning of the most productive 9 months of my professional life. It was the moment I stopped building someone else's vision and started building my own. 6 months after being told I was a tutorial, I was running a company. Not because I destroyed Hartwell Solutions. Hartwell's problems came entirely from Hartwell's choices. I built something separate. Something new. Something that earned every client relationship it had through the quality of the work. What I destroyed was the belief, carried quietly without fully realizing it, that my value was something other people measured and assigned. It isn't. It never was. Marcus Cole taught me that, which is the final irony. The person who tried to erase me gave me the most clarifying moment of my career. He made visible something I should have seen years earlier. I was the thing worth following. I had just been too busy building his company to build my own. I am not busy with that anymore. Kindly like, share, and subscribe for more intriguing stories coming your way. The end.